In August of 1943, in a remote corner of occupied France, dawn crept slowly across a Luftwaffe airfield still veiled in mist. The ground was damp from the night's rain, and the faint hum of generators mingled with the smell of oil and exhaust. At precisely 0400 hours, Oberleutnant Werner Schultz, Chief Technical Officer of Jagdgeschwader 26, received a message that at first seemed like a small triumph amid the chaos of war. An American fighter had been forced down intact, a Republic P-47 Thunderbolt, its pilot captured alive. For months, German airmen had reported encounters with this bulky, formidable new adversary. Now, for the first time, one of these machines lay within their grasp, largely undamaged, a rare prize of incalculable intelligence value. Schultz was not a frontline pilot but an engineer, a quiet, meticulous man who had spent the years before the war working for Messerschmitt, designing and testing aircraft components. His job within the Luftwaffe was to study captured enemy machines, to analyze their strengths and weaknesses, and to recommend tactical or technical countermeasures. When he arrived at the airfield and saw the P-47 sitting motionless on the wet tarmac, his first reaction matched that of every German pilot who had ever faced it in the sky: disbelief. The thing looked grotesque, enormous, almost absurdly overweight, like a flying milk churn that had somehow defied the laws of aerodynamics. Its fuselage was massive, dominated by a great round engine that seemed to swallow the entire nose of the aircraft. Compared with the lithe lines of the Focke-Wulf FW-190, Germany's own premier fighter, the American machine appeared clumsy and inelegant, a brute rather than a bird. Yet appearances could deceive, and Schultz, who trusted mathematics more than impressions, soon began to sense that this ungainly beast might conceal something extraordinary. The P-47 weighed nearly 8 tons when fully loaded, twice as much as an FW-190. German pilots had mockingly nicknamed it Der Fliegen Milchflasch, the flying milk bottle. Schultz could understand the nickname immediately. It seemed too large to fight, too heavy to climb, too awkward to turn. But numbers, not aesthetics, told the truth of machines, and as Schultz began his methodical inspection, the first hints of that truth left him unsettled. He began, as any engineer would, with the heart of the aircraft, its engine. When his team carefully removed the cowling panels, they were met by a sight that silenced them. Before them sat the Pratt & Whitney R-2800 Double Wasp, an 18-cylinder radial engine of staggering complexity and scale. Each row of 9 cylinders radiated from a central crankcase, gleaming with precision-machined metal. It was one of the most powerful aircraft engines in existence, a mechanical masterpiece that represented the pinnacle of industrial engineering. Schultz ran his fingers over the components, tracing the immaculate machining of the cylinder heads, the perfectly balanced crankshaft, the uniformity of every bolt and bearing. Nothing about it suggested the material shortages that plagued German production. There were no signs of substitution, no crude shortcuts, no evidence of recycled alloys. This was not an engine built in desperation, it was built in abundance. Schultz made rapid calculations in his notebook. The displacement and compression ratios indicated a power output of at least 2,000 horsepower, perhaps more when coupled with the turbo-supercharging system he could see snaking through the fuselage. By comparison, Germany's own premier radial, the BMW 801 that powered the FW-190, struggled to produce 1,700 horsepower at its absolute limit. And the BMW engines were notoriously difficult to maintain, each one demanding careful assembly and frequent repair. The Americans, it seemed, were mass-producing engines with greater power, greater reliability, and greater precision, on a scale that defied comprehension. Examining the engine more closely, Schultz noticed something else: it was designed for practicality. Each cylinder could be removed and replaced independently, allowing for quick repairs in the field. A single damaged cylinder did not condemn the entire engine. It was a design philosophy rooted not in desperation, but in expectation, an assumption that engines would be maintained often and efficiently. German engines, by contrast, required extensive disassembly even for modest repairs. The Double Wasp reflected a kind of engineering humility, an understanding that machines existed to be serviced, not worshipped. Then Schultz's attention shifted to the tangle of ducting that extended from the engine down the fuselage. What he saw there filled him with both admiration and dread. This was the P-47's secret weapon, its turbo supercharger. A turbine mounted in the rear fuselage used the exhaust gases from the engine to spin a compressor at over 20,000 revolutions per minute, forcing pressurized air back into the cylinders and allowing the engine to maintain full power at extreme altitudes. The complexity of the system was breathtaking. The ducting had to withstand immense heat and pressure, the bearings had to be made from exotic alloys capable of enduring the turbine's velocity, and the entire system required precision machining far beyond what most German factories could sustain. Germany had experimented with turbo-superchargers before the war, but none had reached operational reliability. The metallurgy and manufacturing demands were too high, the tolerances too fine. Yet here it was, in front of him, an intricate, flawless system built into a production fighter, one of hundreds already in service. It was not an experimental prototype. It was standard issue. He understood immediately what this meant. At altitudes above 25,000 feet, where German interceptors gasped for air and lost power, the P-47 would be reaching its peak. It could climb higher, faster, and remain there longer, escorting bombers deep into occupied Europe while German fighters struggled to reach them. When his assistant asked whether such a system could be replicated in Germany, Schultz shook his head. "Not with our current facilities," he admitted quietly. "It would demand materials we do not have, factories we cannot build, and time we no longer possess." Moving to the airframe, Schultz found further revelations. The P-47 had suffered considerable battle damage before its capture. Holes peppered its wings and fuselage, scars from cannon shells and machine gun bursts. Yet it had still flown, had landed intact, had lived to tell its story. The structural integrity was astounding. The Americans had built it like an armored vehicle. Heavy-gauge aluminum skin, massive spars, redundant control systems, all contributed to an airframe that could absorb punishment and continue flying. German fighters, optimized for speed and agility, sacrificed durability. A few hits from a 20mm cannon could shred an FW-190 or Bf-109 beyond repair. But the Thunderbolt could take those same hits and keep climbing. The radial engine itself acted as armor. Even with several cylinders destroyed, it could still run. And unlike Germany's liquid-cooled inline engines, the P-47's radial had no vulnerable coolant system. You could shoot holes through it, and it would still bring its pilot home. Schultz recorded his observations grimly. The Americans had traded elegance for endurance, agility for survivability, and it was a trade that worked. Their engines had power to spare. They could afford the weight of armor and redundant systems. Germany could not. Its aircraft were built on the knife edge of efficiency, optimized to the limits of materials and design, but with no margin for error, no room for damage, no allowance for fatigue. The Americans built machines to last. The Germans built machines to perform, briefly, brilliantly, but often fatally. Then came the firepower. Schultz examined the wings and found 4 Browning M2.50 caliber machine guns mounted in each, 8 in total. Each weapon fed by 400 rounds of ammunition. Together, they could unleash over 100 rounds per second. He ran the numbers, and the implications chilled him. A single 1-second burst from a P-47 could send 100 heavy projectiles tearing through a target. A 2-second burst, 200 rounds. By comparison, a Bf-109 typically carried a pair of machine guns and 1 or 2 cannons, with limited ammunition. The German pilot's window of attack was measured in seconds. The American could fire again and again, across multiple engagements, without exhausting his supply. The .50 caliber rounds themselves were deadly, high-velocity, armor-piercing, capable of slicing through aluminum and steel alike. Schultz now understood the reports from German pilots who described Thunderbolt gunfire as a wall of lead. Anything caught in its path was pulverized. Against such firepower, the lighter German fighters stood no chance in a head-on exchange. His recommendation was immediate: avoid frontal attacks, evade, strike from below or behind if possible. To confront this machine directly was suicide. By the time Schultz completed his technical report, a pattern had emerged, a pattern that extended far beyond the airframe before him. Every system of the P-47, from its engine to its electrical wiring, spoke of an industrial machine of staggering scale and sophistication. The Americans were not just producing superior aircraft, they were producing them effortlessly, in numbers that made defeat inevitable. Schultz requested intelligence estimates on U.S. production, and the figures that reached his desk were almost unbelievable. By late 1943, Republic Aviation was manufacturing over 500 Thunderbolts every month, with plans to increase that number still further. In Germany, all combined factories struggled to produce 300 to 400 single-engine fighters of any type per month, and those numbers were constantly disrupted by Allied bombing. The disparity was not just numerical, it was existential. The same pattern appeared in the engines. The Pratt & Whitney R-2800 that had so impressed him was being built not in secret, but in vast quantities, over 125,000 units by the end of the war. The same engine powered not only the Thunderbolt but also the F-6F Hellcat and the B-26 Marauder. In other words, the Americans were producing more of a single advanced engine model than Germany produced of all aircraft engines combined. And while German factories substituted alloys, simplified designs, and conscripted forced labor, American plants maintained precision and quality even as output soared. Schultz sat at his desk, running the numbers again and again, as if repetition might change them. But mathematics does not bend to ideology. In 1943, U.S. aircraft production exceeded 85,000 planes, German production hovered near 25,000. And American aircraft were not small, lightweight interceptors, they were heavy, complex machines that consumed more aluminum, more fuel, more labor. The scale of industrial effort was beyond anything Germany could hope to equal. It was an avalanche of steel, aluminum, and oil, burying Europe beneath its momentum. When Schultz prepared his final report for Berlin, he did so with a heavy heart. His conclusions were clear and damning. The P-47 Thunderbolt represented a level of industrial and technological sophistication far beyond Germany's current capacity. Continued engagement with such aircraft under existing conditions would lead to unsustainable losses. He recommended tactical adjustments, avoid high-altitude combat, conserve resources, reconsider strategic priorities. But he knew even as he wrote that these words would be unwelcome. In the Reich, truth was often treated as treachery. His commanding officer read the document and sighed. "You understand," he told Schultz, "that this will not be well received in Berlin. They do not wish to hear that the enemy is superior." When Schultz asked if he should alter the findings, the officer shook his head. "No. Leave them. But be prepared for silence." And silence was precisely what followed. The report was forwarded upward, filed, and dismissed. One staff officer reportedly remarked that Schultz had been demoralized by enemy propaganda. Another called the P-47 a crude product of American mass manufacture, inferior in design but produced in quantity. To men intoxicated by ideology, such truths were unbearable. In the months that followed, Schultz watched his predictions come true. The Thunderbolt appeared in greater numbers over Europe. German losses mounted. The Luftwaffe's elite pilots, men with years of experience, were shot down faster than they could be replaced. Tactical changes came too late, and strategic reality overtook them. The United States had achieved not merely air superiority, but industrial dominance, the ability to lose aircraft and replace them effortlessly, to adapt designs, to overwhelm through production rather than perfection. Schultz examined other captured aircraft as the war dragged on. AC-47 transport, one of more than 10,000 produced, a P-51 Mustang, the elegant successor to the Thunderbolt, powered by a Packard-built Rolls-Royce Merlin. Each new inspection told the same story: superior materials, faultless workmanship, and the unmistakable signature of a nation whose factories dwarfed the combined output of continental Europe. Germany's engineers, brilliant though they were trapped within a system that denied them the one resource they needed most: reality. By 1944, the Luftwaffe's decline was irreversible. Fuel shortages grounded squadrons, bombed factories halted production. The skies above Germany belonged to the Allies. Schultz's early warnings had gone unheeded. The Reich continued to cling to the illusion that superior will, superior blood, or superior tactics could offset industrial inferiority. It was, in the end, a belief that ideology could defeat arithmetic. It could not. When the war finally ended and Schultz was interrogated by American intelligence officers, they showed him his own 1943 report, retrieved from captured German archives. "You concluded, from a single aircraft, That Germany would lose the war? One officer asked. Schultz nodded slowly. Not the war as it was fought, he said, but the war that truly mattered, the industrial war. The P-47 was not just an airplane. It was a symbol of an industrial civilization operating at a scale we could not imagine. Every bolt, every bearing, every rivet was proof that the United States possessed resources and capacities we could never hope to match. The officer pressed him further. Surely you were not the only one to see this. Schultz gave a tired smile. No. Many of us saw it. But in Germany, to speak the truth when it contradicted the party line was to invite ruin. It was safer to remain silent and call it faith. The Americans filed his statement away. In their archives, Schultz's report was found stamped with 3 words, filed. No action required. In retrospect, the captured Thunderbolt was more than a technical specimen. It was a mirror, reflecting the vast gulf between 2 worlds. In its engine and airframe lay the evidence of an economy mobilized on a scale never before seen, factories converted from automobiles to aircraft engines, shipyards turning out carriers alongside bombers, millions of workers, men and women alike, trained, equipped, and supplied with endless material. By war's end, the United States had built over 300,000 aircraft, while Germany managed fewer than 100,000. Of those, more than 15,000 were P-47 Thunderbolts, more than the combined total of Germany's 2 principal fighters, the Bf-109 and Fw-190. The numbers defied belief, yet they were true. After the war, Schultz reflected on what he had witnessed in 1943. His technical mind had recognized the truth long before the generals or the politicians. The P-47 had been more than a machine, it was a prophecy. It proved that wars were no longer decided solely by courage, training, or even tactics, but by furnaces, factories, and fuel reserves. It was the embodiment of an industrial logic that Germany could not challenge. The Nazi regime, blinded by its own mythology, had built a nation of warriors when it needed a nation of engineers. And by the time men like Schultz saw the writing on the wall, the outcome was already fixed. The story of Oberleutnant Werner Schultz and the captured Thunderbolt is, in the end, a story of truth ignored. One man, armed only with a slide rule and an open mind, looked beneath the surface of an enemy machine and saw the future. He recognized that Germany was not merely losing battles, it was losing the capacity to wage war itself. His report was buried, dismissed, forgotten. Yet history vindicated him. The war that destroyed his country was not won in the skies of Europe, but in the factories of Detroit, the foundries of Pittsburgh, and the assembly lines of Connecticut. It was won by mathematics, by metal, and by the quiet power of production. And it all began, on that misty August morning in occupied France, when one German engineer walked around a battered American fighter and understood, with terrible clarity, that his nation had already lost. The P-47 did not end its service with the liberation of Europe. Even after the final battles over the Rhine and the relentless push into Germany, its presence lingered as both weapon and witness. In 1945, as the Third Reich collapsed under the combined pressure of East and West, Thunderbolts continued to patrol the skies over the shattered continent, escorting transport convoys, watching for the last desperate Luftwaffe sorties, and photographing the ruin that lay beneath. The roar of its engine, once the sound of invasion and defiance, became instead a symbol of finality, the echo of a war reaching its end. When the guns fell silent, the airfields that had once teemed with these machines became staging grounds for something new, the reconstruction of Europe and the redefinition of air power. Many of the surviving P-47s were stripped of their combat colors and assigned to occupation duties or to emerging air forces in countries seeking to rebuild their defenses. In the skies over post-war France, Italy, and the Low Countries, a few Thunderbolts still thundered briefly, their presence a reminder of how swiftly technology could reshape nations and their fates. In the United States, the P-47 was already being overshadowed by its successors, sleek, laminar flow designs like the P-51 Mustang and, soon after, the first generation of jet aircraft. But within the strategic community, the Thunderbolt's reputation remained untarnished. It had proven that the war in the air was not merely about speed or maneuverability, but about endurance, resilience, and the capacity of an industrial democracy to produce power on a scale no autocracy could match. That, in the end, was the true lesson of the P-47 story. Its engineering brilliance reflected a vast ecosystem of factories, railways, research laboratories, and logistics networks stretching from Connecticut to California. Every rivet and bolt represented a worker, a foreman, a planner, an ordinary citizen whose daily labor translated into strategic dominance. While the Luftwaffe struggled to keep its production lines intact under constant bombardment, the United States produced over 15,000 Thunderbolts, each emerging from the assembly line like another note in a symphony of industrial might. German engineers who examined captured examples often expressed a kind of grudging admiration. They could not understand how a machine so large, so seemingly wasteful in its use of aluminum and fuel, could be produced in such numbers without bankrupting its creators. But the answer lay not in the aircraft itself, but in the society that built it, a society capable of aligning its economic power with its moral conviction that tyranny could and should be resisted. For the pilots who flew it, the P-47 was more than a machine. It was a lifeline. Many spoke of its cockpit as a fortress, a sanctuary of steel and glass that could carry them through the fiercest flak and bring them home even when riddled with holes. Veterans told stories of returning to base with cylinders shot out, oil pressure gone, wings scarred and torn, and yet the Thunderbolt flew. One pilot described it as the kind of plane that refused to die before you did. Its legend spread far beyond Europe. In the Pacific, where it arrived later in the war, the P-47's ruggedness made it ideal for long-range escort and ground attack missions across vast stretches of ocean and jungle. Its 8 heavy machine guns shredded enemy shipping and airfields, while its dive bombing runs devastated entrenched positions. Japanese pilots, accustomed to facing lighter, more fragile opponents, found in the Thunderbolt a new kind of adversary, one that could not easily be brought down. Yet, despite its formidable reputation, the P-47 story has often been overshadowed in popular memory by sleeker, more glamorous aircraft. The Mustang, with its long range and elegant lines, captured the imagination of filmmakers and historians alike. The Spitfire came to symbolize defiance during Britain's darkest hours. The Messerschmitt Bf 109 embodied the technological daring of Germany's early war years. The Thunderbolt, by contrast, was workmanlike, a tool of attrition, a hammer rather than a rapier. And yet it was precisely this quality that made it indispensable. Modern military historians now recognize that wars are not won by elegance, but by logistics. The P-47 embodied that truth. It was the flying expression of production capacity and reliability, the same virtues that filled Allied convoys with trucks, tanks, and munitions. In every sense, it was the aerial counterpart of the Sherman tank or the Liberty ship, not perfect, but sufficient in such overwhelming quantity and reliability that perfection became unnecessary. The P-47's influence extended into the post-war era, shaping design philosophies that would dominate early jet fighters. Its emphasis on firepower, protection, and high-altitude performance informed the development of aircraft like the F-84 Thunderjet, itself a spiritual successor. Indeed, the lineage of Thunder aircraft in the U.S. Air Force traces directly back to the lessons learned from the rugged P-47. In the decades after the war, when historians and engineers looked back at the machinery that had defined victory, the Thunderbolt was often cited as the most American of fighters, not because of its nationality, but because of what it represented: abundance, endurance, and adaptability. It could not turn as tightly as a Spitfire, nor climb as fast as a 109, but it could fly longer, hit harder, and survive more damage than almost anything else in the sky. The captured P-47 in occupied France became, in its own way, a symbol of that resilience. For the German mechanics who examined it, the aircraft was a puzzle, a machine that defied conventional logic, built not for elegance but for persistence. For the Allied airmen who later reclaimed those skies, it was a testament to the turning tide of the war, the moment when industrial capacity began to outweigh ideology, when the machinery of freedom proved more enduring than the machinery of conquest. As Europe rebuilt, the roar of the Thunderbolt faded into memory. Yet its legacy remained etched in the generation that had flown it, maintained it, or merely looked up and saw it streak across the sky. In museums and airshows today, the rare surviving examples still take to the air, their radial engines echoing with the same deep growl that once shook the fields of Normandy and the valleys of the Ardennes. Watching one fly is to glimpse, for a brief moment, the raw, mechanical heartbeat of an age when the world was balanced between destruction and rebirth. The P-47's legacy also endures in a less visible but equally profound sense, as a lesson in the relationship between technology and morality. It reminds us that machines alone do not decide the outcome of wars, rather, it is the intent behind their creation, the values that drive their makers, that determine whether they become tools of oppression or liberation. The same industrial genius that produced the Thunderbolt could, in other hands, have produced instruments of terror. But in 1944, it was harnessed to a cause that sought to restore balance to a world gone mad. From a historian's perspective, the P-47 stands as a bridge between eras. It was the last great piston engine fighter to dominate the skies before the age of jets transformed warfare forever. Its design marked the culmination of a technological lineage stretching back to the biplanes of the Great War, while simultaneously hinting at the future: pressurized cockpits, turbo-supercharged engines, modular construction, and the integration of radio, radar, and computing into aerial combat. The lessons learned from its development paved the way for the aerospace revolutions of the Cold War and beyond. In the decades that followed, when the Cold War redefined geopolitics and new jet fighters roared across the skies of Korea and Vietnam, the veterans of the P-47 generation carried with them a quiet pride. They knew that their aircraft had been more than a machine of destruction. It had been a shield, a promise kept to those who believed that freedom was worth defending not only with words but with the full force of human ingenuity. Today, when one of the few remaining Thunderbolts starts its engine, the sound is unmistakable, a deep, resonant thunder that rolls through the airfield like the echo of history itself. Crowds fall silent. The propeller blurs, the cylinders catch, and for a moment, the past is alive again. The aircraft lifts from the ground with the same determination it carried 8 decades ago, climbing toward the clouds as if to remind us that courage and endurance are timeless virtues. The story of the captured P-47, and of all those who flew and built it, is therefore not merely a tale of war, but of civilization's capacity to recover from its own darkest impulses. It teaches that the instruments of destruction can also become symbols of protection, that strength can serve mercy, and that even in the most violent of ages, humanity's better nature can manifest through the very tools it creates for survival. In the end, the Thunderbolt's true victory was not measured in the wreckage it left behind, but in the world it helped to preserve, a world in which the ideals of endurance, cooperation, and technological mastery would continue to shape the peace that followed. The P-47 may have been born from conflict, but its spirit belonged to the reconstruction that came after. As one historian once wrote, every rivet on the Thunderbolt bore the weight of a civilization's promise, that its power would serve not conquest, but the defense of human dignity. And as long as one of these aircraft still flies, that promise continues to echo, steady, unyielding, and clear, like thunder across a peaceful sky.